If I'm up on stage and I'm asked to introduce somebody, I forget everybody's name. Like my mind just goes completely blank sometimes when I'm up here. It's hard. We're grateful for our song leaders and for all they do. They get here early, they practice, they do a lot to prepare for the service. For those of you who are smoking a turkey this week and who are going to, if you're going to brine it before you smoke the turkey, make sure you take it out of the freezer today so that it's thawed by the time you brine it. This is just your public service announcement for making a succulent turkey rather than a dry turkey that everyone just forces themselves to eat because it's Thanksgiving. It was great to have Greg Reynolds up here. Greg, we've known Greg since he was a young teen. He was in the same teen ministry with my kids. Of course, the youth and family ministers down in the South region, Alex and Courtney Montgomery, they also grew up with Greg. And so we're trying to bring Chicago here as well. We enjoy the Rocky Mountains so much, we want to make sure that they also get a chance to experience the life here as well. But it's great to have him here in our house during this holiday time. Go ahead and open your Bibles to Nehemiah. We are going to continue our study of the books Ezra, Nehemiah. And, one of the things, when I first began reading the Bible in earnest, you read all the stories with these heroes, and for every flaw that you may encounter with the hero, there's a temptation to try and explain it away. There's some aspect of this person that we didn't understand, but the more and more you read the Bible, the more and more you understand that the account that the Bible gives of God's people is filled with heroic deeds, and it's also filled with a lot of dirty deeds. And David, who is a model of Christ, was still a very flawed individual, and the Bible doesn't take those parts out of its story. It includes every part within it. And, as we read the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, we are seeing some really heroic things done in these books. But at the same time, we're seeing the beginning of mistakes being made as well that have repercussions by the time we get to Jesus' time. The many imperfect stories and heroes that the Bible records, it does not try and give us a Pollyanna account of our people. It tries to give us the most accurate account. Now, as I've seen and read and studied the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, and to some extent Esther as well, one of the things that I see is that there's a direct connection between the religious leaders of Jesus' day and the behavior of some of the religious leaders in Ezra and Nehemiah's day as well. We're going to get into that a little bit. But what we start to see are the seeds of legalism and kind of a fear-based obsession with the appearance of following the law in these books. There are incredible acts of courage, of course. There are inspiring acts of unity and trust, which we should be modeling ourselves. There's levels of corporate repentance that are absolutely inspiring in these books. And yet, something seems to be happening that's also a little bit off. That's not good. And we need to look at that, and we need to look at that without being able to throw the baby away with the bathwater, okay? Just because a hero also does something that is a mistake or that is sin does not mean that this is not a person that shouldn't be admired, all right? Our kids, as they grow up, they have one version of us when they're 4 and 5 years old, all right? And that is that we are nearly perfect. All right, now we want them to hold on to that vision for the rest of their lives. Beginning around 8 or 9 years old, they're starting to see some real cracks in that image. All right, by the time they're teenagers, they think we're the worst people in the world sometimes. All right, and then they have kids. And then they come right back around. One of my favorite books that I've ever read is called Walking with the Wind. It's by a man named John Lewis. And John Lewis was a longtime congressman in Georgia. But before that, he was one of the original leaders of the student-led initiative during the Civil Rights Movement. And he actually was one of the people that gave a short speech the same day that Dr. King gave his I Have a Dream speech. So John Lewis gave a much less well-known speech before that. But Walking with the Wind is his memoir of the student branch of the civil rights movement. And what I like about this book is that he seems to give a very honest account from his perspective, of course, of the people and the personalities of that movement. People who accomplished amazing things, people of incredible courage, but people who were also deeply flawed, who had troubling ambitions for power, and whose motivations were not always altruistic. The book is filled with breathtakingly inspired moments of history, but also with the dark truths of the human instability and corruptibility, even amongst the best of us. And when I read Ezra and Nehemiah, I'm reminded of that book. Amazing people doing amazing things during dark times. But often mixed into that history is the fact that amazing people will still be deeply flawed. And they are not immune from the mistakes, and they're not immune from wrong decisions. This thought brings us to the book of Nehemiah and the inspiring work done by common people to build a wall around a city in 52 days, despite tremendous danger and overwhelming opposition. It's always been one of my favorite stories about unity and about fighting with family for the defense of community. And about all that can be accomplished when faithful people decide to work together, no matter what. All that being said, the subject of the book, the building of a wall, begins with a somewhat uncomfortable question. Why do they have to build a wall at all, if God is supposed to protect the city himself? Zechariah 2, verse 3 through 5. Now, just keep in mind, Zechariah was a prophet that was living with the exiles during the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. And one of the things Zechariah says to the people during that time is in chapter 2, verse 3. Then the angel who was speaking with me went out, and another angel went out to meet him, and he said, "Run and tell this young man, Jerusalem will be inhabited without walls, because of the number of people and animals in it, declares the Lord Almighty. I myself will be a wall of fire around it, and I will be glory within it." Now, this was the prophecy made by Zechariah during the building of the temple. So as the temple was being built, he was saying, you don't need to build a wall. Build the temple, I will protect you. All right, so they did. They were able to build the temple without a wall. They did this before commerce, before government, before residential areas were rebuilt. They built a center of worship first. All right? God would take care of everything else. It goes on to say that he's going to dwell with them as well, and that people of many nations would come into the city. All right? And that he would be a wall around this great community. When you continue in Zechariah verse 10, it says this, "Daughter Zion, shout for joy and be glad, for I am coming to dwell among you." This is the Lord's declaration. "Many nations will join themselves to the Lord on that day and become my people. I will dwell among you, and you will know that the Lord of armies has sent me to you." Yet when we read the stories of Ezra and Nehemiah, that's not exactly what happened, is it? When we read Ezra, we see a kind of passion to enforce, in ways that had never been done before, cultural purity. All right? Not out of a sense of superiority, though, but out of a fear of breaking with covenant again and suffering any penalties for that. By the time we get to the end of Ezra, the exiles have distanced themselves from all of their neighbors, and they forcibly removed the foreign wives and their children from the Jewish men who married them. All right? Now, the Jewish men were not supposed to do that. They were supposed to marry faithful people. All right? Everybody was supposed to marry someone who was a God follower. But it's not really an accurate fulfillment of God's vision to force divorce amongst those who disobeyed originally. So it's a story of many courageous things done, to be certain. And like I said, there was bravery, there was sacrifice, devotion, unity. It's amazing. But there's also these weird actions based in fear. An imperfect application of God's law, perhaps. At least, that's what I take away from it all. By no means are these stories of failure or depravity, but they also aren't the fullest achievement of what God seemed to be envisioning in Zechariah chapter 2. it kind of reminds you of us, doesn't it? Our imperfections as a community are always present. Even on our very best day, like the very best day that we could have, one of you is going to fight with your wife on the way to church. That's going to happen. Someone's not going to be getting along with somebody else. Even when we are at the peak of righteousness, there will always be some issue within our community that's going to have to be challenged, and it's going to have to be resolved. I remember, one time I was preaching in Chicago, and I led one of, the Chicago church has like 7 regions, and I was leading one of those regions, and I was invited into the downtown region to do a Sunday service. And so I was there, and I had this sermon. It was going really well. I had kind of a good illustration using, it doesn't matter, but it was a great Sunday. But in the middle of it, this guy stands up and he starts walking in front of the stage. Okay, now I had used a basketball in one of my illustrations, and he started dribbling the basketball in front of the stage. And, so it's all pretty distracting. And then he jumps on stage, and he kind of like starts dancing around the stage. And I'm like, ushers, we have a problem here. And he was on drugs, and he was just kind of freaking out in the middle of church service. And so a few of the ushers got up on stage and they had to corner him, and then they had to grab him, and then there wasn't like a door there, so then they had to carry him out of the service. All right? That's Sunday service in Chicago. We are a community where some crazy things will happen. Even in the midst of good things happening, there's always going to be a little bit of crazy happening because we're human. We cannot be shocked. We can't be undone. We can't be given over to despair over the fact that as a faith community, we have flaws, sometimes deep flaws. Flaws amongst us, flaws in the community. There were flaws in the community that we read about in Scripture. It's a part of our story. That's one of the things the Bible is saying. This is a part of our story. And I think it's an aspect of every story, of the story of Ezra and Nehemiah. But getting back to our first question, why isn't God protecting his people the way that Zechariah 2 seems to indicate he would? All right, he certainly began that way. But when we get to Nehemiah, a decade after the events that we're reading about in Ezra, Jerusalem is in a state of disrepair and ruin. Why isn't God acting as a wall around his city still? So that his enemies can't attack, so the enemies can't come in and bother the Jewish people. Now here's the other thing with the Bible. Sometimes you don't get answers. Like it says what's going on, and then it doesn't tell you why. It asks a question, and it doesn't always give you the answer. Jesus does this all the time. People ask Jesus a question. You know what he does? He responds with a question. And so, and you want to I'm sure everyone's like, oh, okay, yeah. Okay, but is that a yes? We don't always get answers. What the Bible forces us to do is wrestle with the answers. So even as I pose this question, there is no clear answer. You are going to have to read these books, and you're going to have to come up with your own answer, which probably might change over the course of your life, depending on whether you have teenagers or not, probably. What we do see is that Nehemiah himself chooses to answer that question in a very specific way, and the story follows from there. All right? Nehemiah chapter 1, verse 2 says this: Hanani, one of my brothers, arrived with men from Judah, and I questioned them about Jerusalem and the Jewish remnant that had survived the exile. All right, so Nehemiah at this point is in Susa. He's either in Susa or Persepolis in Persia, and he knows that there is a group of Jewish people returning from Jerusalem, and he's waiting for them because he wants to hear how things are going. So he's waiting at the gates. They're returning, and this is the news that they give him. They said to me, the remnant in the province who survived the exile are in great trouble and disgrace. Jerusalem's wall has been broken down, and its gates have been burned. When I heard these words, I sat down and wept. I mourned for a number of days, fasting and praying before the God of the heavens. Nehemiah goes on to pray to God. We're not going to read the entire prayer. I definitely recommend doing so. But he goes on praying to God, confessing the sins, basically saying, we deserve this. This was what you said was going to happen. He recounts that the covenant that God made with them says that if they remain in their disobedience, if they're disobedient and they do not repent, after a while, he will remove his protection from his people. And that as a consequence, they will go into exile. And they will be brought into different corners of the earth. And Nehemiah acknowledges we're living under that punishment right now. That was a just consequence for us breaking faith with you. He goes, so I understand that we're living in that right now. But Nehemiah prays to God, remembering that the covenant also says that if they return to God in faith, he would gather them again and bring them back to Jerusalem. Nehemiah wants to be part of that process of God bringing people back to Jerusalem. So he prays that God will give him success in what he's about to do. But again, the reader's not told what he's about to do. We just know that he's about to do something, all right? And then chapter 1 ends with this phrase, I was a cupbearer to the king. All right, now, what is a cupbearer? It sounds like a really bad job. And in some ways, it's a bad job because you're testing poison for the king. You're the guy, and so if you die, then the king knows not to drink what you were bringing, all right? But it's not that simple. It's hard to poison the king, so it's unlikely that's going to happen. Really, the cupbearer was a position of honor. Mostly only people of royal descent were given the position of a cupbearer. There are very few people that were allowed consistently into the king's presence to converse with him. The cupbearer was one of the few people who were. So Nehemiah, who probably was descended from some sort of nobility within the Jewish people, is now made a cupbearer, and he comes into consistent contact with the Persian king. Now, we know that coming into contact with the Persian king is slightly perilous from the book of Esther. All right, when we read Esther, the Persian king had a queen. She did not display herself well in the presence of the king or in the way that she should have, and so she was removed from being queen and never seen again by the king. All right, that's because she had a bad afternoon. All right, so this happens likely before Nehemiah. So Nehemiah knows all about that story. Okay, so he is coming into the presence of the king and he is planning to do something. Now, I'm going to give me 4 minutes here for those of you who are history nerds. Just for a second, I'm with you. One of the problems with the Bible is that we have a Hebrew account of history and names, and we're often coming up against a Western account of names in history as well. So as the Jewish people are writing about the Persians, so are the Greeks. So there is a Jewish account of the Persian of history, and there's a Greek account of Persian history. All right, the Greeks, who are, they're pretty condescending towards everybody that's not Greek. They don't care a lot about names. They don't care a lot about titles. And so oftentimes when you read Greek history, you'll see the name Xerxes, or you'll see the name Artaxerxes, or you'll see the name Darius, or you'll see the name Cyrus. And they treat those words as proper names. Okay? Where the Jewish account treats those words as titles. Okay, so the best way to think about this is president is not the first name of Joe Biden. Okay, president is a title. We call him President Biden. All right. Everybody knows, though, that president isn't a part of his name. That's a word that is a title. The Greeks treated the word president as though it was his first name. So when the histories line up between Greek history and Jewish history, it's hard to figure out the order of things because the Jews treat these words like titles. So there were 3 different Artaxerxes, for as a matter of fact. And sometimes when you read the book of Nehemiah, they mix up those words quite a bit because it's like using the word president. So if we're talking about the president in 1940, we know right now as listeners he's not talking about Joe Biden. All right, he's talking about Roosevelt or Truman or I forget. I just did what Carlos did. I forget who was president before. All right. But so it's actually slightly difficult to figure out where someone like Esther fits in the history between Ezra and Nehemiah. All right? We are going to treat today as though Esther took place before Nehemiah. Okay? Why is that important? Well, it's not important to the overall point of the story, but the person that Nehemiah is talking to most likely was Esther's stepson. Okay? So he grew up, perhaps it was his own mother that was banished from the king's sight. And Esther was brought in as a result. So he might be the son of Vashti. All right? On top of that, when you read Ezra chapter 4, there's this tiny little story that goes out of order with the rest of the account. And it talks about a king that tells the Jews to stop building. Okay? And this is taking place probably 50 years after the account of Ezra, but they put it in there just to show that there were always enemies that were courting the king of Persia to get the Jews to stop building, okay? It's not that important, only to say that that king that told the Jews to stop building is probably this king that Nehemiah is talking to. So this person that Nehemiah is talking to may have been the stepson of Esther and also the very king that wrote a letter in Ezra telling the Jews to stop building. Okay? That all becomes important in just a second. All right. Now back to the story. When we go to Nehemiah chapter 2, it says in verse 1, during the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was set before him, I took the wine and gave it to the king. I had never been sad in his presence. So the king said to me, why do you look so sad when you aren't sick? This is nothing but sadness of the heart. Now, it was a punishable offense to be brought into the presence of the king and to not present yourself with almost near perfection. You were to look exactly as you were told to look. You were to wear exactly what you were told to wear. You were not to speak ever until you were first spoken to. And you were definitely never to come into his presence unhappy or sad. All right, now we've already talked about what happened to a previous queen, perhaps this king's very stepmother, who came into the king's presence the wrong way and was banished. All right, Nehemiah is taking his own life into his hands, doing what he's doing. All right, that's why the very next sentence says, I was overwhelmed with fear. Because he knows that what he's doing is dangerous. In verse 3 it says, I replied to the king, may the king live forever. But why should I not be sad? When the city where my ancestors are buried lies in ruins, and its gates have been destroyed by fire. The king asked me, what is your request? So I prayed to the God of heavens. Now, we have all done this so many times, where you're in a situation where you're nervous, and someone asks you a question, and like, you live for maybe 4 months within the breadth of a second, and you say a prayer to God, and you're just like, God, please help me in this moment. Please help me. There's a lot of things like you can't say it out loud fast enough. In your mind, you are praying for a lot of things. And that's what Ezra does right here. All right? So I prayed to the God of the heavens, and I answered the king, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor with you, send me to Judah and to the city where my ancestors are buried, so that I may rebuild it. The king, with the queen seated beside him, asked, how long will your journey take, and when will you return? So I gave him a definite time, and it pleased the king to send me. Now this is an important moment right here. When the Persian king asked Nehemiah what he needed, Nehemiah was ready with a list. Nehemiah was ready for the answer to be yes to his request that he'd been praying for. You know, one of my best friends, he grew up in a family business, and it was he grew up in a restaurant, and his dad always told them, if we aren't prepared for success, then we don't deserve to be successful. All right? And what he meant was that success for a restaurant means having a busy restaurant. It means having it packed, having people line up, having people waiting to get a table. And if they weren't prepared for the restaurant to be packed, if they could not operate the business in such a way that when many people wanted what they had, they were ready to respond to that, then they didn't deserve to be successful. All right? And that always stuck. My best friends use that all the time in talking to me about things even. All right? And Nehemiah, in this moment, he was prepared for everything he prayed for to come true. All All right? When the king asks him what he needs, he knows the timing, he knows the materials he needs, he knows how long he's going to be away. And he's ready to ask the king for all of that. All right? Now, an important note here, and again, I can't emphasize this enough, this is the same king that had earlier probably made the edict telling Jerusalem to stop building. All right, so if you go to Ezra chapter 4, you can see this, at least the person with the same title as this guy is telling them to stop building. Now, one of the things we know about the Persian government is that nobody could overturn a king's edict. All right, when a king made an edict, no one could overturn it. We actually see that in Ezra and Nehemiah as well. Because at one point, the Jews' enemies write a letter to the king and say, hey, they're building the temple. Is there any record of them doing that? You shouldn't let them build a temple. This is a rebellious people. So the king is like, this is a rebellious people. But let me make sure there's no edict saying that they should be rebuilding. He goes and he finds that the previous king, Cyrus, told him to go back and build the temple. And so the new Persian king is like, well, it's an edict. And so don't mess with it. Let them build. As a matter of fact, now you're going to pay for it because you bother me. Okay? What Nehemiah was asking this king to do is overturn his own edict. All right? The biblical world turns upon such courageous deeds of faith. Nehemiah was asking that the building of Jerusalem begin again. And that the king who told them to stop building finance that building. Furthermore, he was asking him to finance the building of a defensive wall that could be used against the Persians if Jerusalem chose to rebel, as they have a history of doing. What is it that we can gain as a faith community from this story in Nehemiah so far? We know that there were millions of Jews living outside of Jerusalem when the edict came that they could go home. That the exiles could return to Jerusalem. Probably less than 2%, probably in the realm of 1% of all the Jews decided to return home once they were allowed to. That means that the process of rebuilding the city was done by a very, very few people. The majority simply watched. They watched while a few of them took all the risks and did all of the work. When we get to Nehemiah, we find a man who is willing to risk everything he has personally in the hope of benefiting everybody else. He has one chance to do it right, and he takes the opportunity. We too are trying to build a home. That's why this entire year we've studied out this theme of home. We're trying to build a good home for ourselves, for future generations of believers, for those we've not even met yet. We're trying to build a good home, but also to prepare a place for when God dwells among us. The same promise made in Zechariah 2 is still a promise to us. Now, we each have a choice of who we're going to be in this community. Either we will be one of the many that watches the few do all of the work, or we'll be one of the few to sacrifice and to work and to give everything we have for the chance of building something worthy in God's name. It's a hard truth to swallow. Here's the thing. Just because you stand up and you choose to sacrifice, and just because you choose to step forward and say, I will do the work, and just because you risk something for God, doesn't mean it's going to go well. It doesn't mean that you're not going to make mistakes. I've watched a lot of good men and women over the years give everything they've had to this particular faith community all around the world. They've bled and they've cried and they've sweat for the faith. And many times they came out the other side as heroes. But just as many times they made mistakes and they sinned. And in those times they paid dearly for it. And when the consequences of their mistakes came home to roost, even the volunteers had a choice to make. They would either accept the flaws and the consequences with humility, while not giving up the attempt to keep risking everything for God, or they would choose to become embittered and fade into the mists of indifference and irrelevance. Worse, some could even choose to disown their own responsibility and begin critiquing all of the people that picked up the banner that they decided to put down. never helping, never again risking, not sacrificing, not putting the shoulders to the plow. Only voices of cynicism and accusation and castigation. The beginning of Nehemiah text begs the question, who are you going to be? And who are you within the community? Are you one of the people that stays behind and watches the few do the work? Or are you one of the people willing to take risks in order to participate in the building that God requires? Are you one of those that becomes embittered at failures, your own or others, so simply stops helping and watches others do the work, critiquing, judging, or simply harassing them along the way? Are you willing to go make mistakes and then get back up again and keep going? You know, there's a famous explorer, I'm sure you've heard of him, his name is Shackleton. And he attempted at one point to sail to Antarctica, this is in the 19th century, unload on Antarctica, cross the continent, and then pick up a ship on the other side and sail home. All right? That was what he attempted to do. All right? And he failed spectacularly. Okay? He never made it to land. All right? He got there, and, you know, the Antarctic seasons are kind of, you know, whether or not the water is open to reach land, it's hard to know. All right? There's no satellites during this time. And so if there's ice that accumulates in the water, generally you wait for the next season because you don't want to get boxed in. So he was approaching Antarctica, and he saw ice in the water, and he was like, okay, it's taken me 2 years to get to this point. Do I want to go and wait another year to attempt again? And so instead, he tries to maneuver his way through the ice, and he wakes up one morning and they're boxed in and there's icebergs all around them and they can't move forward anymore. And pretty soon the ice crowds along the boat and begins to crush the ship. So they have to get everything out of the ship, and they have to live on the ice for 1.5 years. All right? They take a rescue boat, a little like lifeboat, and they sail that to Georgia Island, miraculously arrive there, get to South America, get a rescue boat, go back to the ice, and pick up the rest of the men. Not one person died. All right? For 1.5 years. You know, it's funny because nobody cares that he didn't cross the Antarctic. They don't even question his judgment for trying to attempt it, even though there was ice. What everybody remembers is that for 1.5 years, he got all of his men to live on the ice and make it back safely. But it all started from a horrific mistake that he made in judgment. You know, we have to be ready for success. But don't be undone by failure. We are an imperfect people. There are going to be failures in this community. Building a home is going to have plenty of opportunity for both. But let's not give up. Let's get back up and keep building. Amen. Thank you very much.